Welcome everyone to another edition of Dropkick DiSKussions presented by Sportskeeda. I'm your host Korey Gunz, along with Sportskeeda's wrestling expert Tom Colohue. Tom, how are you doing tonight?
I am good. It's strange to be doing this on a Tuesday instead of our usual Wednesday recording, but it's been one of those weeks, hasn't it? With everything changing, a few things that have appeared that haven't been seen before, and all sorts of things all over, up and down, I tell you.
That is true, and speaking of things changing, let's start right there tonight's show with this past Friday on SmackDown. We saw the Blue Brand gain a new roster member in the form of AJ Styles, and we talked a little bit about this last week when we saw the brackets for the Intercontinental Championship tournament release, that AJ kind of stuck out like a sore thumb a little bit there. We weren't really sure why he was even in the tournament, and I guess we got our answer on this Friday when it was revealed that he is now an official member of the SmackDown roster. Now, before we get into this topic, I do want to take a little bit of time. It's not really Tom's style to pat himself on the back, so I'm going to do it for him here and kind of give him some kudos. If you've been following the show for a while, Tom, take us back in time a little bit. Take us back into the archives of Dropkick DiSKussions and tell us about when you first told our audience that AJ Styles, the plan was for him to eventually make a move over to SmackDown.
Okay, so I'm going to do this, but as you've mentioned, tooting my own horn, as it were, really not something I enjoy doing. I always feel quite nervous with situations like this, but I'm just going to go through the timeline. So I first heard about this potentially happening late January, I want to say about the 20th. And I first reported it on the 25th of January. Now, at this time, what I was told was essentially that they just don't have much for AJ Styles on Raw. At the time, The Undertaker wasn't locked in to be feuding with him at WrestleMania. January, as we remember, a lot of things changed last minute, and a lot of storylines took a different direction than was expected. So around this time, I reported this, and then several weeks later, there was a rather large backlash. A very prominent wrestling journalist killed the rumor, didn't mention me by name. They checked with their own sources. Fair enough, that is their thing. Also, a wrestling aggregation site that does not like me, I'll just say that clear, does not like me, also posted from their sources. Now, it's news to me that they have sources because I've never heard them actually report anything as an exclusive, but here we are. And then I got a minor wave, I'll say, not a huge thing, but a wave of abuse on Reddit and the like, where essentially I am the devil. So with this in mind, you've got to remember, I'm still fairly new to this game, and I'm not used to things like that where there is logic in rumor killing. I've killed many rumors myself. I've disputed things on this podcast. I respect that. However, when the day then comes that something like this is proven correct, just remember what you've said. So if someone comes in and said Styles will definitely not be moving to SmackDown in April after WrestleMania, remember you said he won't be moving when he moves. Because there is, and I've learned this, reporting things too far ahead of time is apparently a negative because people forget. And unless you report something within a week, people won't bother. And it's stuff like Reddit. People will shout and they will scream and they'll say, oh, you can't trust him for this, you can't trust him for that. And then when that exact thing they're annoyed about is proven correct, they go silent. They are nowhere to be seen. I don't want to be here saying, give me credit. I am excited to see AJ Styles back on SmackDown. As I say, what I was told was that they don't have much for him on Raw. And I believe he will be happy to be moving to SmackDown, especially now Gallows and Anderson have moved on for different things.
So there you go. Just another reason to make sure that you're tuning in to the podcast every week because, hey, we give you the news first. You're going to hear it here first from Tom for sure. And, like Tom said, he doesn't like to toot his own horn, but I'll do it for him. Toot, toot. So make sure, like I said, just another reason that make sure you're tuning in and following Tom on Twitter and the like. But now let's talk about the situation at hand. AJ Styles moves to SmackDown officially. He's in the Intercontinental title tournament. We talked about the tournament last week. My bracket is already busted. My guy Sheamus, who I had winning the whole thing, goes out in round 1. He loses to Jeff Hardy. AJ obviously was victorious in his first-round matchup against Shinsuke. So considering the new move, considering the brackets and the way that you're seeing it, is AJ Styles has got to be considered the favorite to win the title now at this point, right?
Absolutely. We talked about this last week, where essentially we were saying it would take 3 of his 4 mandated appearances to even get to the final of the tournament, and if he then won it, one defense and he'd be completely wiped out. There'd be no point having him win that championship. Seconds after it was announced that he had officially moved to SmackDown, I tweeted saying, yep, my prediction, which was a final containing Bryan and Nakamura with Nakamura winning, is gone. It's ruined. Styles moving over is pretty conclusive. At this point, surely AJ Styles has to be the favourite. He's the only one who's got this wave of momentum. And in addition to that, when you bring someone over, they've got to make an impact. They've got to make an instant impact. AJ Styles, and they've said this, the house that AJ Styles built, he's got to live up to his own hype now. And now that he's back on SmackDown, I firmly believe he is more than capable of doing so.
Now, just, I guess it was really 2 weeks ago, we heard about the advent of the Brand Invitational, which was basically a new incarnation of the wild card rule. And, like you said, we saw trickling down of parameters, that someone can only be on another brand 4 times a year and this and that. But then here we see AJ Styles, a guy that now makes a permanent roster move from Raw over to SmackDown, just less than 2 weeks after we saw the Brand Invitational rolled out. Is this something that we might see more of in the future? And then is this another example of the WWE just constantly tweaking their own rules to where now it's not just the Brand Invitational? Now we have the leeway that we might see guys make permanent roster moves, or we might see roster trades, just like we were seeing in the wild card era when we thought the whole idea was to make SmackDown and Raw 2 distinct brands with 2 distinct rosters.
This is definitely a sign of tweaking. And while admittedly the plan was to have AJ Styles move, the original idea for the shake-up, which I reported back in December, was that we would have a standard shake-up after WrestleMania. Raw and SmackDown would have people move across, and NXT stars would move to Raw and to SmackDown. Now, admittedly, because of the situation, they didn't have the full shake-up they wanted, but we still saw a lot of moves. We saw Forgotten Sons, we saw Bianca Belair, we saw Apollo Crews, and others of that like. We are now hearing reports that Matt Riddle is going to be moving to SmackDown as well, which, given everybody who was released from Raw, there's not many people left on Raw at this point when you consider everyone moving to SmackDown. AJ Styles was one of those listed. He's one of those they wanted to make this move. It's just they didn't necessarily want to make it now. They wanted to make it in a formal shake-up. He took some time off after WrestleMania, so things did change slightly, but they are moving back onto that path. What they didn't predict was that they would be doing another version of the wildcard rule, because that has come from pressure by the USA and the Fox networks trying to make this happen. We also saw, and I reported this when they first announced the brand versus brand invitational, we are seeing more emphasis put on the 24/7 championship, which for several weeks, about a month now, has vanished completely and gone completely unmentioned. USA Network have been pushing for that. That's one of the reasons they wanted this wildcard rule. And we are now seeing R-Truth and Gronk cutting promos against each other. A lot of change, a lot of it mandated by non-WWE entities. But when it comes to little changes like this, they don't know that anyone will be traded to Raw. They don't. They are making it up as they go along based on little tweaks because they can't get the big shake-up they were trying to do.
Now, in a backstage promo in relation to AJ Styles, Styles did mention The Undertaker in an interview segment backstage. You would think that, at WrestleMania in a boneyard match where AJ Styles was, literally and figuratively buried alive, that if there ever was a blow-off match to end a feud, the Boneyard match would be it. But he mentions the Phenom in his promo. Are these two maybe not finished with each other? Could we see the AJ Styles-Undertaker feud continue?
I think it's a realistic possibility, and I think the best example of that is that we saw a huge blow-off match at WrestleMania for Edge and Randy Orton, and here they are again. Now, with Styles still on Raw, that battle looked far from over. We saw hints of it at Money in the Bank, a bit of trauma in AJ Styles' mind, and it might still not be. You've got to remember, The Undertaker has been in the SmackDown opening video since it moved to Fox. And after all that, even though they've never been able to put a storyline together to actually get The Undertaker on the blue brand, his last appearance, I believe, was before Survivor Series 2016, it may be that we do see Undertaker return onto SmackDown because they need stars too. And when it comes to Goldberg, currently not available, John Cena, currently not available, they were using those names in the build-up to WrestleMania because they didn't feel that certain members of the SmackDown roster had the drawing power they needed. AJ Styles being moved over is part of that. The Undertaker as well could be part of that, especially right now when there is no Roman Reigns.
Yeah, like I said, I'm not really sure where they would go from here. Like I said, how do you, what's the next step after the Boneyard match? But I also, don't think that many people would complain if we did see a continuation of Undertaker Styles. Like I said, I just, I don't know, is it a burned alive match? Like, I just don't know where they go from here. Now since they've already dumped AJ in a grave and buried him alive, I'm not really sure where we can take the feud from here.
Well, there is a burned alive match called an Inferno match, so that is something they've done before. I'm not sure. It may just be more cinematic nonsense in the best of ways, but I think The Undertaker would be very upset seeing that he literally buried AJ Styles alive and he's still there.
That is true. And if you've been watching the Undertaker documentary, The Last Ride, I think just on this past episode, there was a video clip of him at the time watching a Royal Rumble. I don't think in his mind, the Undertaker's mind, he was going to come back. And he even mentioned that one guy he felt that he missed, that he wanted to work with or wished he could have worked with, was AJ Styles. And so now, he's got the new hip, seems to be getting around a little better. They have their match at WrestleMania. So, maybe this is also some of the Undertaker's wishes that, hey, if I'm going to, wrestle a couple matches a year, I'd like for it to be with a guy like AJ Styles that, maybe can fly around the ring a little bit for me. I know he's going to take care of me. And, by his own words, he's a guy that he wanted to work with.
Absolutely a possibility. I've mentioned on the podcast before the new cinematic way of doing things. The Boneyard matches could really suit The Undertaker having a lot more matches, because they can film them in pieces, they can film them in bits, they can film them over a whole day. You don't have to do 15 bumps in a row when you can do 2 bumps per hour. In addition to that, I would say a lot of people really want to work with AJ Styles. One of the reasons so many people wanted to move over to SmackDown when he was there was to work with AJ Styles. Triple H, Vince McMahon got a lot of requests to move to SmackDown when Styles was on that brand.
Let's move over to Raw now, talk about some of the things we saw develop this past Monday, and maybe the biggest of which was the crowning of a new United States champion. We saw Apollo Crews take the title from Andrade on Monday. Nice win for Crews. He's a guy that's been getting a little bit of a push here lately. We thought he was going to kind of get that moment in the Money in the Bank. They kind of yanked that rug out from under us just to bring him back, and then now he ends up winning championship gold here in the form of the U.S. title. Now, Monday's show, it was on Memorial Day, and a lot of fans may not realize that Apollo Crews actually has some military history in his past before, coming to the WWE and becoming a full-time wrestler. So with his military link and then obviously it being Memorial Day, do you see this as just kind of a feel-good moment for the day and for the evening, and maybe this isn't something that is here for the long run? Or do you think that this was just a perfect storm and the right time to really launch a solid title run for Apollo Crews and really give a guy that maybe hasn't quite gotten his break on the main roster yet and kind of give him the ball and let him run with it?
I think it's a bit of both. I initially thought that Andrade would retain because here in the UK we don't have Memorial Day. And then they started with the vignettes, and I remembered that yes, Apollo Crews does have military history. He did come from a military background and a military school. So I got that picture and posted it on Twitter just before the match as a way of sort of saying, yeah, I reckon he's winning this one. We've unfortunately seen a lot of very short title reigns recently with the United States Championship in particular. And the belt's been dominated by champions in quite small factions. You think of the club, you think of Team Vega now. And even though it's bounced back and forth with some people, it's always been sort of held out of reach by a group. That's not the case right now, but it does mean Apollo Crews is quite vulnerable. Now, I see this as more of a test of Crews' mettle. He's fairly new to Raw. He's never really been given much of a substantial push of any kind. And additionally, the concern that they always had with Apollo Crews was that he couldn't connect with a crowd. He's getting a push when there are no crowds, so it's hard to say for certain whether or not it's been that successful. I think they're giving him a chance to prove himself. He's done very well in a short space of time, but as we start to approach SummerSlam, the WWE tend to focus on more established names. He may lose the title before then.
Now, on the other side of the coin, Andrade's a guy that interests me. You know, when you look at kind of his trajectory over the past year or so, you know, he had the United States Championship. I thought he was really building up some momentum, and then he had the wellness policy violation where he was gone. They kept the title on him during that time, but the title itself, and I thought his character lost a little bit of steam. He comes back. His manager, Zelina Vega, then forms this three-man stable that we talked about a little bit ago here on the show that, you know, was really kind of the MVP of Raw there for a while. For about a month straight, they were the focal point of the show. Now we get to this past Monday. Austin Theory has switched groups. He's now, you know, one of Seth Rollins' disciples, or is on his way to becoming one. Then you got Andrade drops the United States Championship, but then Angel Garza actually gets a big win over Kevin Owens on this same show. Where do you see them going with this angle? Is this something where maybe we'll see an Andrade versus Garza feud? Is Andrade just a guy that they're kind of dropping the title just to build him back up? You know, how do you see all this kind of shaking out with Zelina and the two guys that she's left with in her stable right now?
You're right to say that Team Vega has had times when it's been MVP of Raw. At least a month directly after WrestleMania, I completely agree. It was fantastic. That and Aleister Black, who would always have like a half-hour match. And they needed that to fill time because they only had a certain amount of their roster available, with the lack of big names such as Edge, Randy Orton, AJ Styles, Becky Lynch, who were all taking time off after WrestleMania. Now, that's no longer the case. It's a difficult one because there was never a plan to push this group. There was never even much of a plan to have a group. It was always supposed to be Zelina and Andrade, and then Garza was called up because Andrade became unavailable, and then Andrade became unavailable again, so Theory was called up for a tag match. And every time someone is called up briefly to replace Andrade, they impress massively. People we've talked about Austin Theory being the luckiest guy in the world. Look at Angel Garza. He was called up and his gimmick wasn't fully established. He was called up and told, all right, Zelina Vega's going to go out there and get you over. You've just got to wrestle. And he did incredibly well. And he's over. It's another one where we have to say, if there was no crowd, would these people get a reaction? Austin Theory is one where you have to have questions. Would he get a reaction? However, with someone like Zelina Vega in your corner, you'd have to say yes. When it comes to Andrade now, yes, after losing the match, he spent a while beating up the backstage area with a stick. And he continues to disappoint Zelina Vega. The only one she can rely on right now is Angel Garza, and it was a big win over Kevin Owens, even though he was attacking an injured body part. It could be a sign of things to come, that Garza got a big win, and Andrade got a very big loss.
I don't think there's ever been a truer statement said on this show than if you have Zelina Vega in your corner, you're going to get some kind of reaction.
Absolutely. If I was wrestling, there are some people I would definitely want in my corner. Zelina Vega's one of them. Alexa Bliss also great in the microphone. people like that. I'd also love to be a part of Seth Rollins' stable, to be honest.
Well, let's talk about another big revelation on Monday Night Raw, which was the quote-unquote retirement ceremony next week scheduled for Rey Mysterio. Now, as wrestling goes and as retirements go in wrestling, obviously the first question that's going to pop in people's mind is this real, or are we getting ready to get swerved, bro?
Full-on swerve. Just a full-on swerve. Mysterio is not done yet. His contract's always been a brief one, but there are moments within it that have allowed him to retire ahead of time if he chooses to, because Rey does consider this his last run. We've all seen how well wrestlers like Undertaker and Edge have stuck to the concept of a last run, so who knows. Mysterio wants to wrestle alongside his son before he retires, and Dominic is still training, and training well. A lot of people are quite high on the guy. They don't think he's ready just yet, but that time is coming. The day's coming, certainly not next week on Raw. That's the WWE listening to the rumour mill and reacting. The WWE and the wrestlers have been a lot more aware of rumours recently. You'd look at Seth Rollins changing his entire character, and the segment he used to start doing that was the rah-rah speech that a journalist reported happened that didn't happen. We reported here on this podcast Rey was considering a retirement match for WrestleMania. Since then, everyone seems to be reporting about Rey's contract coming to an end. He has a right to retire whenever he so chooses. It's part of his contract, but it's not coming just yet.
Let's assume that we're going to get the tried and true formula of Rey coming out, making his retirement speech, only for someone to come out and interrupt and make some sort of challenge for one more match. If that's what we're going to get, who do you think could maybe be that foil for him? Who's the guy that's going to come out and interrupt the ceremonies or ruin the night for Mysterio? Do you have a prediction, or maybe just someone that you would like as a fan to see if this is maybe going to be Rey's last big run? Who do you think that would make it a successful one?
Well, unfortunately, the WWE have spoiled it slightly by mentioning that Seth Rollins will be overseeing the retirement ceremony. So I think they're definitely pushing in that direction. If we do get to the point where his contract is nearly over, which is a while from now, a few months at least, then I think there are a number of people. Andrade seems like the obvious one, and I think he's a natural successor. That's someone Rey Mysterio wants to have retire him. But there are others who are very talented. Buddy Murphy, I think, would be incredible in that role.
Yeah.
And I think that's someone that the WWE would lean towards. Look at Baron Corbin beating Kurt Angle. Kurt Angle didn't necessarily want to have Baron Corbin be the one retire him. However, the WWE made the choice, and it's done good things for Baron Corbin's career. He's able to say, I retired Kurt Angle whenever he wants. Buddy Murphy for me would be a perfect choice. But if I was going to do that, I think it'd be an ideal time to have Dominic Mysterio be the one retiring him.
Ooh. Now you're thinking with your head. Now I like that.
Now I'm thinking in my head. Is it a bold take to your style?
I mean, if there's one thing we've learned as well, if Rey Mysterio comes out wearing any sort of shade of salmon or pink in his attire, that may be a little tip of the hat that maybe this retirement's not coming quite as we planned. If Mark Henry's taught us anything, salmon is not a good retirement color.
Absolutely not. Never trust a salmon. Never trust it.
Now, something else we saw on Raw that was interesting was a crowd for the first time in a while. Now, not the crowd that you might normally expect, but NXT members were actually around the ringside area and made the quote-unquote crowd for the show. Something different. We haven't seen that for Raw, at least, during this pandemic era. So first of all, did you like it? What did you think of it?
Well, it was a bit of a surprise at the time. It was nice to sort of play whodunit a little bit and be like, oh, it's up, oh, it's up, oh, it's up. So it was nice, and it's a good way for NXT stars to get a bit of recognition. The horsewomen, Duke and Shafir, were wonderful in just their blatant enthusiasm for everything. It's a shame Shayna wasn't there. But at first, I've got to say, it was pretty jarring. It took a little time for me to get used to having no crowd, and now we go from that to sort of a partial mix of crowd and no crowd. It was confusing. But the wrestlers really responded to it, and we saw results. Apollo Crews, in particular, seemed to really react to the fact that when he shouted out, people responded. That's something you learn in NXT. You see Carmella, Becky Lynch did it for a long time. It's something that doesn't really work on the main roster, but you see a lot of NXT stars having a bit where they're fighting back and then they stop and they just shout. And in NXT, the crowd will react to that. Main roster, it doesn't happen, but you can see how happy he was to have a crowd respond. That said, the WWE did make the choice to have Edge cut his promo in front of no crowd, so the company are learning to play to the strengths of their talent a little bit more, at least.
Now, of course, as is, with the Twitter age and the social media age, when we see something done in one company that maybe was done before in another, we start hearing, the words stealing and copying being thrown around, and that was the case here. A lot of people on Twitter going out and saying, the WWE was just copying AEW, who were the first to really put their roster members out as crowd members when they first started airing Dynamite during the pandemic era. What do you say to this idea of, maybe one company maybe borrowing ideas from another? I mean, it's not like it's something new in the wrestling business, but obviously this was one kind of blatant example of that exact thing going on. What's your take on the WWE maybe taking a cue from AEW with their roster members being crowd members for their shows?
There are some unwritten rules in wrestling, the primary one being don't steal a finisher. That said, this is very different. I did see people on my Twitter timeline calling it copying and stealing, and personally, I just think it's a company learning from their opposition. Clearly someone at WWE has been watching Dynamite. Now yes, AEW did do it first, and there's no disputing that because it's clear and evident, but having a crowd doesn't belong to any one company. The WWE did market research. There was a lot of news about this. The WWE sending emails out to network subscribers and saying, would you like to see this? People knew this was coming. They did their market research. They contacted the fans. Clearly, this was a winner. This was something they've decided to roll with. And people are desperate to see some crowd. So regardless of whether AEW did it first, let's just be happy you got what you wanted.
Now, it was surprising to see the crowd members there on Monday because it was something they hadn't done before. Then when you saw the Drew McIntyre, Bobby Lashley segment where those crowd members actually got involved in kind of the, the pull-apart brawl, then it was kind of like, oh, okay, that makes sense why they were there, why they were put in place was for this angle. Is this something that we're going to see continuing in the future, or was this simply just staging for the sake of getting an angle out there, so the roster members were only there to be a part of this brawl, and now we may not really see them present from week to week?
We're definitely going to see them on Friday because SmackDown has already been taped. At the minute, they're waiting to see what response it gets, because if they get a positive response, they'll keep going. But for the moment, NXT stars have been told you will be needed going forwards on these times. So for now, business as usual is NXT talent in the crowd. If it's a positive response they get, they will continue to do it. But there was one negative to it. The WWE really didn't want information getting out there there'd be a crowd. Information from Raw and SmackDown tapings has not been getting out since they've moved to the Performance Center. Nobody's been told this is happening. Nobody's been told that's happening. And we haven't had spoilers and anything like that filtering through. WWE were very happy about that. But this week, a lot of information got out. And Vince McMahon was apparently not happy at all. There will be inquiries. Because now they can say for certain someone in that NXT talent is giving information to wrestling media. So the information getting out has put a few people under pressure. What that means for a crowd, we'll have to see going forwards. I think they'll stick with it. NXT talent, as I mentioned, have been told they will be needed in the future. But that said, WWE will look to find out who has been leaking information. If they can't find it out, they may end up pulling the crowd.
Let's get to a couple other little news bits before we wrap up the show. First of all, we talked last week that the main event from Backlash has already been announced as Edge versus Randy Orton. We talked about the just silliness of it being called, the greatest wrestling match ever and all that goes in with that. We talked about that extensively last week. But you had a report that what we may be looking at for this match is more of the cinematic universe of the WWE, that we may see something akin to, the Money in the Bank match and the Boneyard match, maybe something that is pre-produced, and maybe something that goes a little bit beyond just your normal match, even more beyond their last man standing match at WrestleMania, which was pre-recorded, but was still, really in essence a normal type of match. So Edge versus Orton, greatest wrestling match ever. Could this be the next installment in this cinematic world that we've seen since WrestleMania?
It's likely at the moment. We spoke just after WrestleMania about comparing the Boneyard to the Firefly Funhouse, and I did say at the time the Boneyard was very well received and they wanted to do a lot more of it, whereas the Firefly Funhouse not that well received, but they would keep it in the locker if need be. So they are looking to essentially try and get at least one cinematic match for every pay-per-view because of the massive reception that they get from fans. As long as at least there are no crowds, that's something they want. Nothing's been filmed as of yet, so I can't say for certain, but Edge and Orton is currently slated to main event Backlash. And a big cinematic main event is very much the style for wrestling now. That was the case with Double or Nothing as well for AEW. When you call something the greatest wrestling match ever, they cannot live up to the hype. They just can't. It's not possible. But if they can convert it to something entertaining, I think they're on to a winner. Give me a massive, bombastic musical number matching The Greatest Showman that they're taking their theme from, and I'll be happy. It'll be universally panned, but Tom Colohue will be ecstatic.
I mean, what are we talking, like Randy Orton in a top hat and a cane, like dancing around? Like, what? I mean, what? Let's get into the mind of Tom Colohue.
Tell me you wouldn't love it.
What are we talking here?
Tell me you wouldn't love it. Just tell me that. That's all I want. Just tell me you wouldn't love it. Just being serious for a moment, though, taking the Landstorm treatment, just to be serious for a moment. Edge and Orton wanted to put something together at WrestleMania that proved that Edge could still go, not just to the fans, but to Edge as well. And they weren't able to do that because the match style that they had involved a lot of pausing. They had a lot of times where they had to relax or stop, and perhaps Edge doesn't feel like he's quite proven his place yet. So we may end up with a 30-minute wrestling match. But wouldn't it be so much better if it was just some cinematic, out of nowhere, absolutely insane thing that you can't even adequately put into words because it's just pure madness?
I do feel like I'm kind of leaning your direction as far as that because of the hype they've put up. I feel like it's got to be something other than a wrestling match. Maybe, and like you said, maybe it's going to be something that's just so absurd and so out there that, that's why it's the greatest wrestling match ever, because it's going to have everything under the sun that we could ever think of. Yeah, and I could see Edge, being a guy that would maybe be up for that, especially with his antics with Edge and Christian, and, he's got kind of that quirky personality. Maybe that would be something that he would be ready to go for. I don't know.
Absolutely, and I think Orton has relaxed a lot in previous years, and he was in a Firefly Funhouse match that was very different from the one at WrestleMania. So he's up for that as well. I think the two could put together some absolute magic. And I think back to the early days of Baron Corbin versus Dolph Ziggler, the very first feud that Baron Corbin had. Dolph Ziggler for ages said, we've done Falls Count Anywhere, we've done no DQ. Now I just want a straight wrestling match. And he came out in his wrestling cap, and he did his stretches, and then he kicked Baron Corbin in the balls. I don't know about you, but I would find that hilarious.
We shall see. We shall see. I'm definitely looking forward to it. I mean, hey, they've got me hooked, so I think that that's the whole point. So they definitely have me intrigued. Last thing we'll talk about before we wrap up the show, Drew Gulak was a guy we just talked about last week here on the podcast about how he came to get, not really his release, but his contract came to an end with WWE, and we thought we had seen his last match for WWE 2 weeks ago on SmackDown. But now, maybe that's not the case.
Very true. Drew Gulak is back on SmackDown. He did wrestle yesterday, Monday, I should say, during the SmackDown taping. The contract negotiations never ended, even after he left. He himself never leaked contract information to the media, which I've mentioned many times, WWE very happy with Drew Gulak for doing that, eager to continue working with him. Ideally, the WWE wanted nothing to ever even be mentioned. I've mentioned it earlier in this podcast. They are very unhappy with the amount of information that is coming out of their tapings right now. But his contract was supposed to end, negotiations would continue, and then he'd sign a new one. And to be fair, if you take away the media and the speculation, that is exactly what happened. He stuck to his guns, they backed down, they got him a new contract. Gulak apparently wrestled in a Battle Royal, and honestly, I'm interested to see what the Battle Royal's for, because every championship is already accounted for at Backlash, surely.
Yeah, just, when you first told me about this, just taking a shot in the dark, the first thing that came to my mind is maybe it's some sort of like last chance to get back in the IC title tournament. Like maybe it's all the losers in the tournament in a battle royal, and then so maybe the final will be like a triple threat. Like I said, I don't know. I'm taking a shot in the dark here, but that was one thing that kind of popped in my mind that would be something that maybe Gulak would be involved in.
Possible, and that would certainly suggest that maybe Daniel Bryan would be winning it so that we could see a rematch.
Yeah. Man, if that was the case, we talked about potential finals last week. You mentioned AJ Styles and Jeff Hardy, which is looking like that could be exactly what we get. But what if it was some type of last chance and we got a triple threat of Styles, Bryan, and Hardy, or something like that? I mean, I would be there. I would tune into SmackDown for that, for sure.
The thing is, they could take the 8 men who were in this tournament and have them wrestle in some variation every single week in one-on-one matches. Have a SmackDown 8, and I would be thrilled. Mm-hmm. So much talent there.
Oh yeah, Styles, Bryan, and Nakamura in a 3-way, or the possibilities would be endless. And we've seen it before. Paul Heyman, the SmackDown 6, that seemed to work out pretty well for them. So, hey, why not try it again?
In addition to that, I know probably a lot of listeners right now will be saying, oh, but not Baron Corbin. And I disagree with that. I think Baron Corbin does have a lot to offer. He just wrestles a very traditional style. And if you've seen him in no disqualification matches or the chairs match against Kalisto, he does very well with a high-flying opponent. Imagine Jeff Hardy going for the Swanton Bomb and being caught into an end of days.
A lot of possibilities. Hopefully the WWE taps into a lot of this potential that we talk about. Sometimes it doesn't always unfold that way on screen, but like I said, I think the opportunity is definitely there. And Drew Gulak is a guy I think that's right in there. I'd love to see him in the ring with any of those guys. So we'll see what happens Friday on SmackDown with that. And I'm sure it'll give us lots more to talk about for next week's show. We appreciate you guys listening to the podcast this week. If you are clamoring for a little bit more Tom Colohue or a little bit more of Tom and I together, Tom is actually appeared on Foul After Dark, which is on the Foul Original channel. He and the host of that show had a discussion about journalism versus clickbait, which is something, if you listen to this podcast, that we touch on as well. So Tom has some interesting takes and thoughts on that. So please be sure to go over to the Foul Original. That's FOWL ORIGINAL channel and check that out. And then also coming up Wednesday at 5 o'clock, Tom on his personal YouTube channel will be uploading a video that he and I did as we discuss The Undertaker. And we have a little bit of a debate about, is The Undertaker the greatest wrestler ever? And that will be uploaded Wednesday night at 5 o'clock. So you can go over to Tom's personal YouTube channel to check that out if you would like. We had a lot of fun doing that last night, so we'll hope that you'll take that in. Make sure
that was 5, just to be clear, that's 5 p.m. EST. If you're listening to this and you're from India, as a lot of Sportskeeda fans are, it will be later than that. UK, it's 10 p.m. So there are a few changes in time there. For Indian time, I believe it's somewhere like 1:30 in the morning. So check it out in the morning afterwards, by all means.
Glad Tom mentioned that. He's got the time zones covered. So, yeah, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So wherever that may be in your neck of the woods, make sure that you check that out once it goes up on Tom's page. Or just make sure you subscribe to his channel, and you'll get a notification when it goes up, so you be sure not to miss it. Make sure that you're also liking and commenting on our video here about the podcast, and you're subscribing to the Sportskeeda YouTube channel. You can also follow Tom and I on Twitter. Tom is at Colohue, and I'm at Korey Gunz. and check out Sportskeeda.com for the latest wrestling news and articles. We thank you again for joining us this week, and we'll see you next time on the next Dropkick DiSKussions.